Don't get glum, Ned. Let's pretend. Would we live at Middlezoy? What do you mean, he asked. With my parents? She didn't like to tell him, for fear of hurting his feelings, that they had not been her dreams. Her dream included a thatched cottage at Middlezoy, down close by one of those great rhines where the otters were found. But she now plunged boldly on. With them for a while, Ned, perhaps, till we had money enough to have a farm of our own. A farm of their own? This phrase of hers was so delicious, so filled with a floating sense of enchantment, that for a second he dallied with it as if it were serious. But it was not serious. None of it was serious. Yet against him, before he could marry the daughter of the great Wessex nobleman, such a solid weight of conventional obstacles that it seemed madness to think about it. Noblemen's daughters had married commoners before now, but not often, and as far as all accounts went, never a Zoyland. He wasn't an adventurer. He wasn't a rascally pilgric like one of those lean rogues lambasted in Rabelais, who set their scurvy wits to deface, deflower, debauch, and abduct some sweet-blooded noble wench of an ancient breed. It would only be for a time, she began again, that I'd have to live with your people. We should soon be able to find a place somewhere near Middlezoy anyhow, with a few acres that would suit us. Oh, please stop, Rachel, please stop. His voice was really tormented, and the girl looked at him in astonishment. You simply don't know what you're talking about, he went on irritably. It's impossible to imagine, for 1 second, you're living with my parents. Impossible. I tell you, it's impossible. I don't understand you, she said. Oh well. Anyhow, we haven't to consider it just yet. We've had many a lovely time together, Ned, before we have to consider it. So don't look so sad. But she herself sighed long and deep, and she looked across at Glastonbury Tor. Ned moved now. He had been vaguely conscious for several minutes that every time he leaned back, his shoulders encountered the prickles of the gorse bush under which lay their log. It occurred to him that his companion, whose clothes were thinner than his, might be suffering from these gorse prickles. He twisted his head around. Yes, they must be prickling her shoulders. He jumped up and pulled her to her feet with him. Too near the gorse, he murmured. He had only grasped her arm, but his touch sent an electric vibration through her, a quivering like that which sometimes seizes upon one single tree twig when everything else is still. I wonder how long it's been lying there, she said. It's very old. Both the young people gazed down at their recent seat. The log was certainly very old. Neither of them could tell what sort of tree it had been once before, or even if it had once grown near where it lay. It was covered with dark moss and green lichen, and at one end of it was a cluster of little yellowish toadstools. It may have been here hundreds of years, she whispered. A rush of thoughts, vague and indistinct, but full of a curious pleasure, floated through her mind. How many people, old and young, must have passed this way and glanced at that old log, long before she was born? A sense of the wistful and terrible beauty of life took possession of her, especially of life lived long and quietly in one place. I like to grow slowly old, day by day, very gradually, older and older, she said. Ned looked at her with his forehead gathered in great puckers. She looked incredibly childish in her long straight dress and black straw hat. I suppose you never knew what you might find buried on this hill, he said. I am glad that Mayor is going to buy the house where the Red Spring is and built an arch. He talked a lot to me when you were gone last night about an arch. He's got it into his head that a Saxon arch would be the thing, but someone, the vicar I think, has told him there wasn't such things as Saxon arches. I hate that vicar, said the girl fiercely. Oh, come now, Rachel, he's not a bad old codger. He told me if we were going out for the house that he collected butterflies. Just what he would do, said Lady Rachel. Think of killing a thing like that. And she pointed at a somnolent meadow brown that was fluttering over the green bracken. I used to collect butterflies when I was young, said Adeline gravely. All the more shame to you. She longed to scold him, to agitate him, to make him feel troubled in his mind. Not necessarily about butterflies, about everything. The sun, slanting now from the west, was drawing out every kind of fragrance from that hill slope, but the wandering airs that stirred the curls under her hat were full of the scent of primroses and moss. Bees kept flying by them, and every now and then a great blue bottle fly drummed past their ears, with a peculiar come-and-go quiver of tiny wings that hold the whole summer in its sound. I sometimes feel, he said, with an evident struggle in his mind to tell her something that was hard to express, that it's a weakness of mine to go on writing poetry about what I enjoy and what isn't easy to describe. New forms are coming into art, drawn from invention and machinery. Well, you know more about that than I do, having been to Paris and so on. And drawn, too, anyone can see, from the lives of people in masses, working people in masses. And I sometimes feel as if there was something babyish in going out with the old country themes, with the old love and death themes, when the other arts are following this new way. He had given her her opportunity. With burning cheeks and gesticulating hands, she freely attacked him now, all the stirrings of her love transferred to her argument. It's pure snobbishness, what you're talking about, she cried. You say to yourself, I must be modern, when you ought only to say, I want to find out how to express what I feel. He looked at her gravely. But isn't it important to keep in touch with the world spirit? I feel somehow, Rachel, as if all those Grail stories, all this medieval mysticism, has grown tiresome and antiquated. You'd better ask Philip Crowe to give you a ride in his airplane. Her voice was quivering. Had she come down here from listening to all this talk of London only to find her Ned repeating it? You'd better go over to Wookey Hole and see the remarkable electricity they're installed there. And if you're interested in machines, there are some fine up-to-date ones in Crowe's dye works. You'd better go to Philip Crowe and tell him how impressed you are by his great industrial undertaking. What has made you so angry with me, Lady Rachel? What have I done? It was since I've known you that I've gone dissatisfied with my poetry, so full of old tags. It's since I've known you that I've wanted to make it more original, more subtle, more in line with our times. Her face was a picture to see as she struggled with her contending feelings. I don't want you to alter it at all, not in anything, she cried. I wish you hadn't made me talk about my poetry, he said. I had a feeling it would annoy you. It hasn't annoyed me, only standing on this hill where Merlin was and everything. I feel as if you were taking the wrong turn. You spoke up so splendidly for Mr. Gere just now in that house, and now you seem to be taking the other side. What's poetry got to do with taking sides? Poetry is an art. Oh, don't use that word, Ned. If you'd heard what I've heard, the talk, the affections, the affectations, the boredom. But isn't it an art? Her reply was almost screamed at him. No, it isn't. It's poetry. Poetry's something entirely different. Oh, I know I'm right, Ned. If you go on and get hold of this horrible modern idea that poetry's an art, I don't know what... She stopped and clasped her hands behind her back. Well, anyway, Lady Rachel, he said, it has nothing to do with this Glastonbury quarrel between Gerd and Crowe. It has everything to do with it. Can't you feel, Ned, as we stand here, that this place is magical? What's poetry if it isn't something that has to fight for the unseen against the unseen, for the dead against the living, for the mysterious against the obvious? Poetry always takes sides. It's the only lost cause we've got left. It fights for the impossible. Young Atling answered in a mumbling, muttering voice. He swooped down and picked up a bent stick that lay on the grass, flicked his boots with it. It was meeting you that started me, thinking of these things, and now you got and ride over me. I tell you, Lady Rachel... Don't be silly, call me Rachel. I tell you, he went on, I want my poetry to be a new, living, original thing. I want it to deal with machinery and inventions. It's all very well. He kept flicking his ankles harder and harder with the stick he had picked up. To go on writing about Middlezoy hedges and ditches and Sedgemoor tombstones. But I want my writing to flow forward where life is flowing. The girl's face grew stern and very sad. Not realizing what he was doing to her, young Atling had outraged something in her that was almost as deep as her love for him. That was indeed mingled with her love for him. It was one of the causes of it. Ned, listen to me, she said. I've heard all about this quarrel between Mr. Garrett and Mr. Crow. It's been mounting up and mounting up till it's become, like the Montagues and Capulets, something you can't escape from. If you and I are to go on seeing each other, we must agree with this. It's dangerous not to agree about it. She uttered these last words in a low, solemn tone. Ned Atling looked at her in bewildered astonishment. To his mind, it was simply unbelievable that she should take seriously, even to the point of quarreling with him, these ridiculous local politics of Glastonbury. He did not realize how deep in her inherited Zoyland blood, the passion for cause and statecraft and for all of the transactions in what is called history went. He suddenly felt that it was incumbent upon him, at all costs, to change the topic of discourse. She herself had called it dangerous, and it evidently was dangerous. He looked down at their log. It was not only invaded by the gorse prickles, but it was now covered by the shadow of the gorse bush. Do you say I could lift that log, he said, or do you say I couldn't? I say you mustn't because it's been there so long, Ned, and has all those funguses on it. But she now gave him the first smile he had had since they got up in their seat on that log. He threw away the stick he had picked up and his cap about after it. He bent down and handled the log, tugged it at its first in one direction and then in the other. It only moved a few inches. It was deeply buried in the grass, and hundreds of infinitesimal weeds grew at its sides. He knelt down, the better to get a purchase, and tugged at it. It moved a few inches and then fell back into its bed of 100 years. You can't, Ned. It's silly to try to do something that you can't do. Let the old thing alone. Please, Ned. Please, I ask you to. But he did not heed her. He now straddled across the log and, bending low down, his feet planted deep upon the grass, he folded his hands under one end of the thing, slipping his fingers carefully through the weeds so as not to disturb the toadstools, scratching his knuckles on various little roots, but at last getting a really strong hold upon it. The girl was watching him now with riveted attention. Her hands, hanging loose on her sides, began plucking nervously at her belt, and with one of her feet she tapped at the ground. Atling possessed the muscles of a farm laborer. All his life, since he had revolted at leaving home and had only gone to a dame's school in a neighboring village, he had done heavy manual labor, but he now tugged and strained at this wayward enterprise to no avail. And all he could do was just to tilt at the end of the log in about half an inch. But he had not yet made full use of his shoulders or the muscles of his flanks. Drawing a deep breath and balancing his feet firmly on each side of the log, he grappled with it again. It began to move. It moved. No! Setting himself down again with a weight of gravitation that seemed abnormal, and as if it were intentional, the log slipped from his hands and, subsiding into its former position, lay there inert, motionless, triumphant. He had failed. Don't you mind, Ned, cried the girl, coming towards him and touching his shoulder with her bare hand. That touch was, as it were, the sweet accolade of the defeated. It was the first time in their experience of each other that she had made such a gesture, and at a good moment did she make it now. Avante, she said. We must hunt for that stone. Soon we shall be late for Miss Crow's supper. Not a word did he speak as he walked by her side across the hill. Humiliation gnawed at his midriff like a rat at a thick, sweet-smelling board in an old barn. She was nice about it. She had said, "Don't you mind, Ned," and had touched him with her hand. But it was not her pity he wanted. He wanted her admiration. He wanted her respect. He wanted her hero worship. See you next time.